So welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Evolution. So Let's Talk Evolution is a podcast specifically discussing emerging trends within technology, digital transformation, and more recently, AI being the buzzword at the moment. So today we're specifically talking about what gives companies a sustainable competitive advantage in the AI world. And I think today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Chris Marshall. So Chris leads IDC's Asia Pacific research on data analytics, AI, and sustainability, where he's a VP focusing on helping IT vendors and enterprise end users understand global and regional trends, and with more and more of a focus more recently on AI. So the last few podcasts that we've done have obviously focused very much on AI and how AI impacts both large and small companies. And I think one of the topics that seems to have been more and more a pain point or a talking point of a lot of the people who follow us and who we talk to on a day-to-day basis is, how companies can maintain sustainable competitive advantage in the current world. So delighted to be joined by Chris. Chris, it'd be great if you could just do a brief introduction on yourself.
Sure. Although I've been the last 8 years, I've been at IDC leading both the industry research and the AI research in the region. I'm also very much involved in global financial services and a variety of other things. But my background more generally is really about how analytics, AI, technology has changed the face of a host of different industries. And I've worked at IBM and Oracle and KPMG. I shouldn't mention that on this podcast, but over a long, long time in different parts of the world as well.
Fantastic. So we've kind of pre-prepared 3 questions, which have been, questions which people give feedback they're quite keen to hear some answers for or answers to. But feel free to take the discussion in any way it goes, and feel free to discuss any other points that you think would be interesting. I guess the first point, all in relation to how companies can maintain a sustainable advantage. If AI is becoming commoditized, what actually becomes the differentiator? And a few examples of things that have been talked about is like data distribution, speed of decision making, stuff like that. But what becomes a differentiator now?
I think it's worth just reminding everybody what was the big idea and Michael Porter came up with this 30 years ago or so, and he talked about competitive advantage and what constitutes it. And he actually originally said that lower cost was a way of developing a sustainable advantage. Problem is that can be copied too easily, right? So let's leave lower cost aside. And the other thing that he said was that competitive differentiation. In other words, people are willing to pay higher prices for differentiated offerings. Now, the challenge is, of course, commoditization with AI. AI supports differentiation, certainly. It allows you to see it in a host of different areas, whether it's, customization in terms of the front office or customization in terms of content. All of these are great ways of producing differentiated offerings that can lead to some sort of long-term sustainable competitive advantage. And sustainable is a key word here. It's got to be there for the long term. It's not something that can be easily replicated. But I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of people think that AI gives you competitive advantage. And frankly, that's just not true. It's just not going to happen. Simply because the models are converging increasingly. We're already seeing that in terms of the performance benchmarks. High quality AI is becoming fairly generic, to be honest. The models aren't the bottleneck anymore. Instead, they're just increasingly replaceable. So value always goes to the bottlenecks, right? If there's a problem, if it's difficult for some reason, that's where the value lives. So then you've got to think about, where does the value live when you use AI to do anything really in an organization? And there's a few obvious places. I mean, you mentioned data is the obvious starting point, especially if you've got proprietary data that nobody else has got, because it allows you to, build unique models that are specific to your customers based on their particular data, their processes, their risks, whatever. So that proprietary data is still quite fundamental. Now, the fact of the matter is, I mean, you mentioned, I think, decision-making speed is one of your options. And I think the way to think about it is that data plus decision-making speed is perhaps the core part of that differentiating capability, because it's only when you've got that ability to make decisions on proprietary data and then put something in the market and get feedback from that, that you're able to really learn from whether your customers liked it or not, and therefore, learn from the experience of interacting with your customers. And that decision, I think you called it decision velocity or decision making speed or something like that. I think that is quite key, because it's the data platform plus the ability to get even more data using AI. That is the sort of people talk about the AI flywheel. That's exactly what it is. It's a positive feedback loop that allows you to, start with where you are, usually on a data platform, and then actually use that data to add value to your customers. And by doing so, guess what? You get more data from your customers, and you build up this learning loop, provided you organizationally are capable of doing that, and you're able to be, flexible and agile enough to adapt the way your organization works to respond to those changes. And I think that is perhaps the core, the guts of what constitutes a potential competitive moat. And again, just to remind everybody what a moat is just used to be a day when you'd have a big kind of water barrier between a castle or a town or a city to prevent invaders coming in. And they'd actually go over this moat. The fact of the matter is that most of the things we've talked about so far, AI in itself is not that moat. It's only this strange combination of data plus decision-making velocity, or whatever we want to call it, organizational learning, you might call it that, and the ability to actually deliver that value to customers, your customers. So there's a distribution element to it, certainly. But I think for the most part, the key things you've got to focus on if you want to be around in the next 20 years, it's probably about that competitive advantage through data, and also the ability to leverage that data to actually generate better decisions, add value to your customers quickly, and thereby learn even more to do it better. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And you mentioned moat there. So a lot of people have talked about building a moat, and like you said, it's kind of an old historical reality that we don't obviously see any more in a physical sense. But talking about that ability to build uniqueness that people can't easily copy, terming that as a moat. What does an effective moat look like in reality, and what doesn't count as one?
An awful lot of things don't count as well. But I think what the core idea of an effective moat is something that's just very hard for your competitors to replicate. And there might be a variety of different reasons. Maybe it's, your cost base. Maybe it's your distribution. Maybe it's your, as we've said, maybe it's your data. Maybe it's your unique product offering. Maybe it's your location. And many things could constitute a moat that might be important for your particular business in your particular industry. So I don't want to generalize too much. But in the IT and AI space, I think a lot of people call moats things that are really just nice features, functions, slight head starts, which are nice. Nothing wrong with them, and we need those things. We need to be continuously improving our functionality of our offerings. But the fact of the matter is, my cute piece of functionality is something you're going to copy next week or maybe a few months later. So I think a real moat is partly about this durable, hard to copy advantage. And usually, frankly, those advantages are not technological. They are usually, maybe it's about regulatory position. Maybe the fact that you've got, you're very close to MAS means that you know exactly what MAS is going to do before your competitors do, maybe. Or maybe it's the Fed, or maybe it's the switching costs. If you're SAP or Oracle, it's very difficult to switch from those vendors. That's really a pretty hard competitive moat for companies to sort of compete with. Maybe it's economies of scale. Maybe you've just got such huge economies of scale that nobody else can even get a look in because, you just priced out of the market. Yeah. The other thing that I think is important about real moats is that they get bigger over time. In other words, again, it goes to this positive feedback loop. The more you do, the bigger it gets, and the more valuable that advantage is. I mean, I think of is it Amazon AWS's marketplace? I think that wasn't. I don't consider that particular competitive advantage, 2 or 3 years ago, but it's rapidly becoming one. Maybe it's Tesla's, driving data. They have so many vehicles on the road that are gathering so much data about the world. Guess what? The vehicles are getting better. So there's sort of economies of scale, you might call network effects in some sense, and they're pushing the quality of the output, of the value of the output, to improve all the time. The other thing I think that is embedded in moats is usually some sense of it's deeply embedded inside your operating model. And again, it goes back to SAP. Nobody wants to change their ERP system because it's really, really painful. If you're a bank, you don't want to change your core banking system. It's really, really painful. It's like changing the fundamental operating system of how your body works. You don't want to do that. It's too painful. So inevitably, they can, as an economist would say, they can gain competitive advantage. They can gain economic rents from that, essentially. So I think that's the way to think about these different types of moats, and how AI isn't really the source of the moat. It just exacerbates an existing moat usually. And usually it's data related, it's about processes, it's about maybe network effects or economies of scale, maybe there's a regulatory piece to it. So I think all of those are real moats that AI helps with. It doesn't give them to you, but it helps certainly. Most of the things that we talk about with AI tend to be kind of bit generic, techie oriented, and frankly quickly removed.
Yeah, we can email 100,000 people at the click of a button.
Anybody can do that.
Used to be a USP, but now then became commoditized, and now is more of an annoyance.
Absolutely.
So,
and in many ways, you might actually be undermining. I mean, we've seen this in wealth management, for example. A lot of companies. I used to be at UBS in my past life. And at UBS, we obviously had a big wealth management practice, private bank. And we said, well, why can't we use AI and technology to support our private bank clients? That makes sense, right? The problem is you talk to a guy with 20 million at your bank and you say, I'm going to give you a nice AI tool to play with. The first thing he will say is what the, etc. And he'll probably will not be terribly impressed with that offering. What he's paying for in that case is not AI at all. It's actually the ability to have tailored, customized, very, very proficient, low risk advice from people. And I think there's a danger that, especially at the high end, companies throw away the expertise, the baby with the bathwater, if you like, that high end quality, simply because they want to jump on the AI bandwagon.
I think that's a massive point, and a couple of things come to mind, like specialization, like owning a very specific niche. If you're not a huge company that can offer all things to all people, did a podcast a couple of weeks ago about the future of consulting, and the person contributing on that podcast was talking about T-shaped skill sets, and going now in consulting, you need to be going like a mile deep in your specialization, as opposed to what consulting in some instances become, which is the reputation sometimes in a negative sense is, we'll put some slide decks together and charge you a load of money for putting those together, and then you go and try and execute based on that slide deck.
I'm sure PwC never did that, but anyway. But that's right. I mean, you and I are both in industries that are being hugely affected by, let's not kid ourselves, this is a knowledge revolution. I mean, whether it's IDC or PwC, we're all in the business ultimately of gathering information about, in this case, markets or what customer best practices, learning from that and actually translating that into action. And no question, Gen AI has changed the nature of how that's going to work. So we have to add something special. And I think we might argue that the special sauce that certainly PwC and IDC add is hopefully trust, right? One of the weaknesses of the AI story is that obviously the whole brouhaha about hallucinations, etc. But there's a larger question about, do I trust? Can I explain? Do I understand what the outputs are? Can I convert that into something I can communicate clearly? These are sort of topics that are fundamentally human, because whether we like it or not, I think humans are going to be involved in communicating the results of AI, maybe
Yeah.
indefinitely, because we don't buy from machines.
Yeah.
Machines are, in one sense, are never accountable. It's always, I buy from people. Yeah. And I want to know that, if I buy something from you, Jake, and it goes pear-shaped, I know I can come on the phone and say, Jake, you sold me
Yeah,
this, and
100%.
I'm unhappy. Or vice versa. You could say, that was a great job. But I think it's that accountability, that trust is the sort of the boundary of AI that we're sort of exploring in your business and certainly in mine. And how do we ensure that we frankly justify our trust with our clients? If we can't justify that trust, people, frankly, like consultants or analysts, have a limited future.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess on that point of people buy from people, and you mentioned the example of private bankers, and relating to moat, I guess one of the things that we've observed, and I just wondered the extent to which you see this, is a polarization between high value, high touch, higher cost, versus low value, low touch, high volume, high automation. So, for example, could you see somebody working with a private banker if that introduction was made purely through an automated process? Highly unlikely. But if you were buying a Google subscription, you buy that through an automated process. So the lower the value the product, is there a higher likelihood of somebody be willing to purchase that product through a bot or an email or a WhatsApp or an automated transaction versus a higher value product where you would always want a person as your main point of contact?
I mean, I suppose you might argue that this, in fact, I think the whole idea of high touch and whatever the other one was, high volume, that's been around for 30 years, 40 years even, probably. And that concept that there's somehow a schism between two very different ways of approaching the market. I think the reality is it's probably more of a continuum than anything else. Some things, if you're unhappy with your mobile phone service, you want a human being on the line because, I can't figure out why this router is not working in my particular apartment or whatever. So I think it's going to be a little bit of a blur. I don't think, and even the private banks of the world, I mean, when I was at UBS, we were certainly a little anti-AI because of that issue. I think that's changed now. I think now it's much more the case that people use the technology where it adds value, usually relatively low risk, and probably low risk is the key word here, right? It's the risk of the interaction going wrong is probably the biggest determinant of whether we use AI. If there's a high risk of it going wrong, you want a human in or on the loop, if not on the loop, and potentially taking accountability. If it's a low risk transaction, I get a particular suggestion for a book I want to buy on Amazon or whatever it is, then that's fine. I mean, nobody's going to get upset about that. But if it's a high risk transaction, then you want to be sure that there's a human being who's going to take accountability, responsibility, that you trust, and that you can ask them, why the devil did you suggest that? I mean, the classic example of this is a doctor, or oncologist, or something like that, where you go to the oncologist and you say, my oncology report says I might have cancer. What should I do? And they'll say, well, given what I know, or given what the AI model says, maybe it says you should go through chemotherapy. But as a patient or would-be patient, I'm probably not going to be willing to accept that. Instead,
Yeah.
I'm going to say the risk is just too high for me. I don't want to go through the pain and the suffering associated with that. I want to know exactly why you think I should do this. And I want to know alternatives. And I want you to come up with bright ideas. I don't want an average decision. I want the very best decision.
Yeah.
And an average decision is what you're going to get with Gen AI, quite honestly, because that's what it is. It's a meta-analysis.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And just talking about people, and we're both in a people business now. Our business is, our customer is people, our candidates are people, and everything that we do is very people orientated. I've seen a lot of rhetoric recently on work culture, and this isn't directly specific to AI, but it's obviously AI is driving a lot of conversation around layoffs and replacement of workers in favor of automation. But if we think about culture in a business, then we've almost gone from a polarity again from 2021 where companies are rolling out free food, work wherever you want, work from home, work remotely. We're not going to police what you do and where you are because we want to retain you, to now where a lot of companies are changing that internal rhetoric to, we're only keeping the top performers. We want a higher performance standard than we have done before. And, I've seen this in big tech, in banks, in our industry. And now even the 996 concept that was historically talked about as being a kind of reality in some Chinese companies being trumpeted as the new culture coming out of some companies in Silicon Valley and saying, oh, you don't have to work for us, but if you do, this is what we expect. I guess my question is, do you see culture as a moat? Like the culture of a company as a potential moat?
Yeah, I think I do. I mean, at the risk of sort of cultural stereotyping, which is always there, you already see, and again, I'm not going to name countries, it's too complicated, but certainly some places are more reluctant to adopt innovations. And there may be good reasons for doing that. So certainly there's national cultural issues. There's individual company cultural issues that make a difference. I mean, some companies are much more willing to adapt and be flexible with technology and adopt whatever's needed to make it happen. Some, on the other hand, are very, siloed, and it's not my job, it's your job. I'm not going to do it. Why should I do it? You don't pay me to do this. So I think that attitude does vary, and to some extent, the more flexible you are, especially in a period of change, the more likely you are to survive. That is quite straightforward and quite obvious, I think.
Yeah.
But I do think that the world is moving towards I mean, you mentioned the T-shaped, skill base, but I think it's probably even more complicated than that in some ways, right? Because it's not simply that you need the generalist skills to be able to adapt. It's probably more like an M shape or something. I don't know what the right letter is, but where you sort of have pockets of expertise that you're able to draw upon as needed. But there's sort of a network structure that allows you to hook in your expertise with my expertise, with so-and-so's expertise, who lives in God knows where. And I think that story is quite key. I think AI is going to be part of the glue that glues those people together. I mean, I think, one of the things that we tend to get over enamored with AI is that we tend to think of AI as being creative. AI is not really creative at all. It can only give you what's already been developed to some extent. It's, as I say, it's like a meta-analysis or an averaging process of what data, what content we already have.
Yeah.
And in one sense, if you don't have the expertise, the creativity, the imagination in your people, you're also ultimately a bit doomed, because, where are you going to get this creativity, this innovation from? It won't be from an AI. AI is sort of syncretic. It brings in things together and it sort of sucks them together and says A plus B is now something new and interesting. That's great, but that's not real innovation, I don't think. I think we might debate this, but I think the people have got that key role in making that genuine innovation happen. Now, some companies are more eager to do that, and obviously it'll be painful. I mean, I don't think any technological innovation has ever happened that has not been a bit painful for large parts of the population, and this is no exception, I'm sure.
Yeah. Makes absolute sense. And you talked about AI not being an innovator yet. And there seems to be a huge amount of rhetoric flying around about AI's capability. What would you say is the biggest AI myth leaders believe today that will look naive in 24 months?
You mentioned this before we started, and I must admit my first thought on this was essentially that AI leads to competitive advantage, and somehow that AI automatically gives you competitive advantage. And I think that may have been the attitude maybe 2 years ago or 3 years ago or something like that in smaller companies, which were wowed, frankly, by some of the innovations in DeepSeek or in ChatGPT or what have you. I think we've gone beyond that a little bit. I think now perhaps the myth is that AI will completely remove the role of people in organizations. I mean, I think yesterday I saw something on the news feed about, AI is here for knowledge workers or something like that. And there was talk about its impact on the markets and what have you. I think that is going to look a little naive. And I think it'll look a little naive in the sense, for example, 100 years ago, maybe more than that, 150 years ago, there would have been articles that were written about the future of telephones, right? And they would have said in America in 1900, that have said something like, well, telephones are going to change the nature of work. It doesn't matter where people live because I can always call them on the phone, right? I can always dial them up and ask them anything and they'll tell me. So I don't need experts anymore because I just need, call the best expert in the world and he'll tell me the answer, give it back. And I think our conversation about AI will look a little bit with some changes, a little like the conversation that we had 100 years ago about telephones. Instead of telephones changing the business, they just become part of the fabric of business. And AI will be the same. It'll just be another tool, a very important, useful tool we couldn't survive without. But on the other hand, it's not going to be that magic sauce that changes everything. I mean, I think human beings, we seem to have a natural desire to look for a silver bullet. Yeah? We want this magical thing that's going to solve all our problems. AI is probably not it, in a way that perhaps, the internet is not it. It's a useful tool, no doubt. The telephone is not it. AI is not it, precisely because it has fundamental limitations that hopefully, humans can step in to augment the technology or be augmented by the technology, depending on how you look at it, and actually add that secret sauce that does make a difference and actually does lead to competitive advantage moving forward.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess to close, and the majority of people who follow us as a business are technology people at all different levels, in the workforce. And I think the one question I always ask at the end of these podcasts is, a lot of people are worried about AI's impact on their own personal situation with regards to employment. And there are some roles which are becoming less relevant, or there are some functions within organizations where AI can perform almost the entirety of that function. We talk about data entry and, roles like that, but certain roles within finance, certain roles within operations can be, significantly performed by technology. And arguably that's always been the case. But with the amount of AI and generative AI technology that's now available to everyone, if somebody is in a position where they're either looking to pivot their career to focus on something that retains relevance long term, or they're looking to upskill themselves in the age of AI, what's one sort of actionable piece of advice that you would give to people in that situation?
I mean, it's funny. I mean, like a lot of companies, we've seen AI impact, or rather help the more senior folks within the company more than the more junior ones. And that's perhaps a little surprising. I mean, maybe at first glance you might say, well, all the junior people start to look like the more senior people. But that's not particularly been the case. And one reason I think that's not the case is because the more senior people usually have the ability to ask better questions. And I think it's that ability to ask better questions and be critical about the responses. You ask Gen AI generically, you ask a question, you get a response, you say, oh, that's not exactly what I wanted. Can you emphasize this or suggest that or tweak the question slightly? Or what about this situation? How does that fit with this? It's a dialogue. It's an interactive discussion with the technology. And I think one thing that a lot of people, frankly, struggle with is that they take AI at face value. And I think the real value and the real opportunity for people to learn is when they start to be genuinely critical about the outputs that the technology gives you. And when you do that, it's not a one shot, what is the answer? Instead, it's a conversation. And I think one thing that senior people especially need to be doing much, much more is a healthy dose of cynicism and skepticism and the ability to critically argue and think about what it is that the data, the tools, the analytics is telling you, and be able to think, what does that mean? Is it true? Do I trust it? Is it real? Is it practical? These are things that make you valuable. Unless you can give that sort of, I won't call it wisdom, but it's sort of like a higher level, a meta-analysis on top of, the fairly superficial analysis that the technology can give you now. You're going to struggle to show your value add. So I mean, both of us have backgrounds in philosophy, and I think that's fascinating because I actually do believe that sort of critical thinking is not less important. It's more important than ever because you want to go for the hard things that help you understand the real complexities of life. I think it's a bit naive to say, well, if you're into AI, we should teach you R, we should teach you Python, we should teach you, this SDLK or whatever. That's not the point. Those things change all the time. And because it's ephemeral, inevitably, it's going to go out of date very, very fast. And it will cease to be any advantage to you personally in your career development. So think strategically is my point as an AI, would-be AI user.
Yeah, super interesting. I think the majority of contributors have answered that question by saying, use AI, use the tools. And I think it's a really interesting perspective to think this series of podcasts, which are specifically focused on AI, has probably been now ongoing for a period of 6 months. And I think that specific advice at the start was very relevant of using AI, use the tools that are available, get used to it as possible things that could help in day-to-day workflows and then sort of expand it if it does work. But I think now working on the assumption that the majority of people in white collar roles are using AI to a certain extent in some capacity, whether mandated or voluntarily, and looking at the perspective that you brought up, which is actually critique the output, critique the answers that it's giving you and think about things like you say strategically or philosophically even around whether that's the right response, whether it's right for you, and whether the context of what the output's displaying is a help or a hindrance to what you're trying to achieve. I think that's super valuable advice for people perhaps slightly more mature on the journey of now everyone knows what ChatGPT is. Let's not just be entirely dependent on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people talked about prompt engineering a year or two ago as being a survival skill. It is, but it's more than that. You've got to go beyond that into more of a deeper understanding of what exactly are you trying to achieve with the question, and how does it prompt another question, and how does that dialogue emerge, and how are you going to use the value that's created in that conversation?
Fantastic. Chris, thank you so much. It's been a super interesting discussion. Really appreciate you joining us and contributing to what was a slightly different perspective at the end, but I think really valuable and timely at the moment, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Jake. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.